This will be Thank you, Susan. Yes, this meeting will be recorded, and we will send out the recording after so that anyone can refer to it. And anyone who wasn't able to join us but was able to sign up for it, they will get the recording. And you will be able to apply for CM credits. However, apparently there's currently a bit of a glitch in the system, so we'll also follow up on how to do that. I'm going to quickly share my screen to start us off. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on the future of passenger rail in Wisconsin. We have a fantastic lineup for you today, and I'll get to everyone in just a moment. But I first want to introduce myself and 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin. So I am Carl Glazemeyer, the Transportation Policy Director of 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1996. We got our founding to promote good land use policy, and now we've really entered the space of transportation as well so that we can advance healthy communities, positive economic outcomes for all of Wisconsin. My co-worker, Susan, is the one who also helps run Active Wisconsin. So that's something that we are quite involved in. It's a coalition of communities and advocacy groups. So if you want to learn more about what we do, definitely reach out to us on social media. Look up what we do on our website and sign up for our e-news. So without further ado, let's get into who we have presenting today. We have Jen Murray, who's going to kick us off. Jen is the director of the Bureau of Transit, Local Roads, Railroads, and
Carl,
Harbors.
I'm sorry, I'm
Yes.
going to interrupt you because I don't think your slides are advancing.
Oh, my slides are not advancing.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're not seeing you in presentation mode.
Okay.
So sorry.
No, that's fine. It's good to make sure everything's going smoothly. And if it's not, is it advancing at all now?
You
think
may
you have
be
to click on
sharing the wrong. You may be sharing the wrong window.
You have to click on slideshow. Click on slideshow.
It advanced now, Carl.
What'd you say?
It
Okay,
did
it's
advance.
It did? Okay, so let's get back to where we were. So we have Jen Murray here from Wisconsin Department of Transportation, who's the director of the Bureau of Transit, Local Roads, Railroads, and Harbors. And Jen, if we've missed any of that, there's a lot under that umbrella. Please let us know and correct us. We also have the pleasure of having Trevor Young, who's the director of Transit and Mobility with Ride Racine in the city of Racine. And last but not least, we'll have a presentation from Liz Callan, who's a senior transportation planner at the city of Madison, who specializes in transit, passenger rail, and public engagement. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Jen Murray to share her presentation.
Just to say that those slides did not advance.
Okay.
Okay, I am going to attempt to share my screen here. Can everyone see my first slide?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Murray. I work for the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. And yes, I am the director of the Bureau of Transit, Local Roads, railroads and harbors. It is one of the longest titles in the department's lineup of different bureaus, and it took me a long time to memorize it actually in the beginning because I didn't want to forget anything. So thank you very much for having me today. I have a brief update that's focusing on the Wisconsin rail system and the corridor identification program that is going on right now that I'll be briefly speaking on. And this presentation is really just to give you a brief understanding of that program and also Wisconsin DOT's planning process. So in 2022, as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the federal government assigned FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, to establish the Corridor Identification and Development, or Corridor ID program. And there were several goals that were outlined for FRA in the bill. For planning, this Corridor ID program really would build the foundation for long-term rail planning throughout the country and facilitate the development of intercity passenger rail corridors. Ultimately, in the last few months, the FRA selected 69 corridors across 44 states that would be the initial Corridor ID recipients. FRA hopes to upgrade 15 existing state or local supported rail routes, add or extend service on 47 new routes that may not have any identified funding yet, and advance 7 new high-speed rail projects. And as I mentioned, this would create sort of this pipeline of intercity passenger rail projects that would be ready for implementation and future investment across the country. Now, before FRA's selection and as part of establishing Wisconsin's passenger rail priorities, last summer, Wisconsin DOT completed the Wisconsin Rail Plan update to the year 2050. As required by FRA in Chapter 5, WisDOT has included a rail service and investment program. And WisDOT used this plan to develop the applications that were sent in for the Corridor Identification Program. All of Wisconsin DOT's applications were approved and implemented into the Corridor ID program by FRA. Wisconsin DOT submitted 4 based on the rail plan, and they included the increase of frequencies between Milwaukee and Chicago, creating more frequent Hiawatha trains that would underlie the ability for the state of Wisconsin to expand eventually passenger rail across the state. The second corridor was adding an additional round trip between the Twin Cities and Chicago through La Crosse after a planned service expansion yet this year. The third corridor would establish a new service from Chicago to the Twin Cities through Madison and Eau Claire. And the fourth corridor that was accepted into the program would extend the Hiawatha, or that train between Chicago and Milwaukee, all the way up to Green Bay. So here's a list of the corridors that were accepted into the program. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see there were 2 other awards in Wisconsin. One which was submitted by Eau Claire County for a corridor between Eau Claire and the Twin Cities, and one that was submitted by Minnesota DOT for the Northern Lights Express, which is a service running between the Twin Cities and Duluth and would have a stop in Superior, Wisconsin. So individually, all of these different corridors have different elements of planning that we will be looking at. And some of them are even visionary corridors. And it's important to remember they're all starting in step 1, but we'll be moving through the stages of planning at different paces. Now that the corridors have been selected for further planning, FRA's next step will be partnering with the sponsors. So in the case of Wisconsin DOT submittals, they'll be partnering with us, and we will begin to work with them on developing what's called a service development plan. And this slide really shows the steps in the corridor planning process. Corridor ID creates a framework where potential projects moves from the very initial planning phases into service development and scoping, and then further on into the study process. And then this is how FRA is hoping to create that pipeline of projects across the country to understand where all of these projects are moving through that pipeline and to assist entities in funding their programs. So here's a display or a slide that sort of shows those initial steps. As I mentioned, all of Wisconsin's awarded corridors will start at step 1 in the process. This is corridor scoping, and it's really meant to create a scope of service for the second step. The second step is service development plan, and that will really help all entities understand the important service improvements, for example, that might be needed with freight railroads. It will also help us define roles and responsibilities, a preliminary look on what's needed to actually implement passenger rail service. You'll see in step 3, there is corridor development identified. This is typically the environmental process step. So things like an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, those types of activities would be occurring in step 3. And then step 4 and step 5, which are final design and construction, are not funded through the corridor identification program. However, these steps would take into consideration other FRA programs that might be available at the federal level to assist with rail development. WSDOT's going to be scheduling work on all of the state-run corridor ID studies this spring with FRA. We will have a phased approach. Our first study will really be to begin on the Chicago-Milwaukee increases in 2 daily round trips to 10 daily round trips instead of 7. This is WSDOT's top priority because it will enable future service north and west of Milwaukee. And as soon as we get the Federal Railroad Administration grant agreement completed this spring, we will start on that. And then this summer, Wisconsin DOT will begin step 1 for the Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Eau Claire, Twin Cities corridor. We'll begin to look at creating a scope of work for the service development plan that will analyze the entire route from Chicago to the Twin Cities through Madison and Eau Claire. In spring of 2026, WSDOT plans to start step 1 for the Chicago, Milwaukee, La Crosse, Twin Cities additional round trip. And then in early 27, WSDOT will begin step 1 for the Chicago, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Hiawatha extension. So as I mentioned, we're just getting kicked off with the FRA this spring on a grant agreement for step 1. And this is a little bit about what's involved in the very first step. So we will develop a schedule and a budget for the service development plan, which will happen in step 2. And we will also ask some questions. We'll include a summary of work that's been undertaken to date. We will ask things like, what are our goals for the new services or improved services? What are some alternatives to achieve the goals? What are the types of improvements that might be needed and how much do they cost? What order should things be constructed in? So these are kind of more of a scoping phase where we're really asking big questions. There's not a lot of detail in this phase or step in the program. And we start to develop some initial answers that we really investigate in great detail in step 2. So that's what I have for you today, Carl. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I forgot to mention, at the end, we will have some time for Q&A. So if you think of a question during someone's presentation, definitely put it in chat. You don't have to remember it. You can put it in the chat and we'll get to it at the very end. But now it's time to turn it over to Trevor Young from the City of Racine to talk about the KRM. Oh, Trevor, you're still muted.
All right, thank you very much, Carl. So what I want to do today is discuss the City of Racine's efforts as it relates to the Kenosha-Racine-Milwaukee Regional Passenger Rail Project in our corridor study. But before I jump into that, I want to thank 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin for their endless advocacy in the state of Wisconsin for issues related to transportation, sustainability, quality of life. This work that's done by folks in city halls and Capitol buildings couldn't be possible without having public support for these types of initiatives. So I want to thank you, Carl, and Deb, and Susan, and all of you who are members of this great organization for your work. So what is the corridor planning and federal funding application work that's being done in Racine? My name is Trevor Young. I am the Transit and Mobility Director for the City of Racine. And it seems as if that my job has largely been working in tandem with our partners at SewerPAC to get this project over the finish line. So the KRM commuter rail is a recommended plan in SewerPAC's Vision 2050, which is Southeastern Wisconsin's long-range land use and transportation plan. As you can see by this map, the KRM route runs on the Union Pacific line down to the city of Chicago and up to the intermodal station in Milwaukee, with downtown Racine and downtown Kenosha as principal stops. Now, this is not the first effort for KRM, but I am excited to share with you the different approach that the City of Racine and our partner SewerPAC are taking as we bring consultants on board to engage in this study. So then the question is, how did this study process begin? So the City of Racine secured a $5 million appropriation from Congress to engage in this work, thanks to an appropriation secured by Senator Baldwin. That appropriation was in large part secured due to the regional support for this type of program. The cities of Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, and some suburban communities in between passed resolutions to support the project. And because of that appropriation from the senator and those resolutions from those communities, the City of Racine has entered into an intergovernmental agreement with SewerPAC for support and management of the project. And what we'll be doing with this study is assessing different service designs, assessing who are the potential sponsors for this type of project, and how are we going to address the funding question locally, knowing that many of these federal funding programs require that type of local match. And the goal of this study is to position the region to a point where we can apply for a federal funding program. So what are the approach that the City of Racine has along with SewerPAC related to this question, and why is it different? So the City of Racine, looking at Brightline and other passenger rail services across the United States and the world, have seen that there are private opportunities for partnership and funding as it relates to passenger rail. So this two-pronged approach as it relates to this study is going to assess how the transit-oriented development that would occur around passenger rail stations would impact the project itself from a funding perspective. So the questions that that study will be asking are, what are the baseline real estate market conditions within the KRM corridor for multi-use development? What is the potential for a new passenger rail service in the corridor to strengthen and create additional market demand? How much new development and new value capture is needed to bridge a funding gap between capital and operating costs as it relates to bringing about passenger rail? And then finally, what methods of value capture are available with the understanding of Wisconsin state law in order to bring about funding for the project. So that is the element of this work that sets it apart from previous studies that have leaned on other methods of local funding as it relates to state dollars. So that positions the region to have an overarching rail corridor planning and federal funding program application study. And in that study, the work done will be to explore the KRM corridor context and develop preliminary passenger rail service concepts, qualitatively evaluate passenger rail service concepts and identify alternatives, prepare a KRM application for entry into either an FTA with Federal Transit Administration or FRA, Federal Railroad Administration discretionary funding program, depending on what type of service concepts are recommended through the study. And then, of course, work with regional representatives on a steering committee and project partners to identify a project sponsor and solidify that funding strategy. So the project timeline is, we hope that in late Q1, early Q2 to have that TOD value study, value capture study complete. And for the overarching study, which will incorporate the findings of the first, we hope to have that complete by the end of this year. Now, this is aggressive, this is ambitious, but we know that we must strike while the iron is hot, as referenced by the bipartisan infrastructure law and federal monies going towards this type of project. We've had engagement with Union Pacific and other partners around this study as it is their property. And so it's going to take partnership between the City of Racine, the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, Union Pacific, and our surrounding municipalities to ensure that there is alignment around connecting this corridor. But with all of that being said, the real exciting element of this work is the why. The City of Racine, from my perspective, working for the city, this is an absolute game changer for the trajectory economically for our community. We're in the heart of the third largest economic region in the United States of America, the 10th largest economic region in the world. But we are the largest city furthest away from an interstate highway in the Midwest. This means that even with these incredible assets of a historic downtown, award-winning architecture, one of the top 10 freshwater beaches in the country, we still suffer from stubborn unemployment and stubborn levels of poverty that are higher than the state average. And so what do you do to bring these assets to the next level? You connect them to the region. So I want to just chat a little bit before I conclude today around the why. So number one, passenger rail service. Bringing that to the corridor would improve mobility and increase transit use and enhance access to employment, education, and contribute to desirable economic outcomes in Wisconsin's most densely populated area, which is about 23% of Wisconsin's population. You know, knowing that we're in the heart of the Chicago-Milwaukee region, this is approximately $830 billion of GDP. We want to make sure that our residents in southeastern Wisconsin are connected to that type of economic and power. And knowing that there's massive disparities between Black and white residents in terms of economic outcomes, household attainment, unemployment rates, to be able to provide access to jobs, to centers of care, recreation that aren't centered around the personal automobile, we have a strong case to be made through the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative to make those types of investments in the Kenosha-Racine-Milwaukee corridor. And we know that household access to an automobile is less than half the regional average based on access to the personal automobile as a proportion of the population. So without enhanced passenger rail service, you're going to continue to see higher than average unemployment rates, and then lower than average incomes without this type of access to this amenity. And then it's also about attracting the next generation of talent to southeastern Wisconsin. You know, we want to reverse the trend on young skilled labor moving into Racine, Kenosha, and the communities in between Chicago and Milwaukee, where they can call them home and have access to the quality of life that passenger rail would provide. And it was mentioned by Jen that there's a huge effort around the Chicago-Milwaukee connection with Amtrak. And we know that ridership is telling us that we need to invest more dollars and in this type of service in this corridor, because there's a massive demand, one of the largest demands for passenger rail outside of New England. And we know that with these urban centers of Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, you've got a development pattern that was pre-automobile. And so to have transit systems that can service a passenger rail system that's regional with walkable neighborhoods where you have mixed use development that could occur around the station, we know that that would bring about the quality of life that people demand but also the environmental benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and creating a more sustainable environment. So knowing that we've got that $5 million secured, we've got consultants who just recently were approved by our Common Council to be on retainer, and that they'll be aggressively working on this study to prepare for a federal application. There's a lot of work ahead. We've just begun this effort. But I want to thank all of our partners who've been engaged in this work thus far, from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation to Kenosha, Racine, and Milwaukee staff to Sewer Pack. And we look forward to sharing more about the findings of this study and provide updates from now until its conclusion. So thank you, Carl.
Thank you so much, Trevor. That is a fantastic update. So excited to hear that it's back on track. So now I'm going to pass it over to our last speaker, Liz Callan, who will talk about what the city of Madison is doing for passenger rail. So take it away, Liz, and thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Carl. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm going to provide an update on the Madison passenger rail station study. So just a quick overview of the presentation today. We are going to kind of give an overview of the project and, kind of why are we looking at a station location in Madison. I'll walk you through at a high level the process we use to evaluate what we are calling station area corridors, and I'll explain more about what that means. But as we started to identify station locations, we began at kind of an area corridor level, and now we are at the point in the study where we have identified station sites. And so I'm going to walk through kind of our process for that, and then just give a very, very high level overview of the sites. And I can provide a link in the chat with more detail if anyone's interested in kind of diving into that. And then happy to answer questions and talk a little bit more about the next steps in the timeline for this effort. So this really piggybacks on Jen's presentation, because the whole reason that Madison is looking at a station is because Madison was identified as a future stop along the routes that WSDOT is studying. So this is a map from the state rail plan. As Jen mentioned, in December, they received notice that they were awarded federal funding to work on planning. And so the route that Madison is on, as was mentioned, is an extension of the existing Hiawatha between Chicago and Milwaukee to Madison, and then eventually to continue on northwest to Minneapolis, St. Paul, potentially through other communities as well. So that's where Madison kind of fits on the map. And a little bit more about our station study process. So we are just over kind of the halfway point of the study, but we began by, gathering data and understanding what was done through prior efforts and prior studies, studying rail between Madison and Milwaukee and in other areas, identifying goals and defining the station program elements that we're working on. identifying and evaluating the station area corridors. So those general areas around Madison along existing rail line where we think a station could make sense. And then within those corridors, specific sites. So that's where we are right now. Our general timeline for the study is to later this year, hopefully spring or summer timeframe, to have some recommended, ideally a recommended site, and then potentially an option B and C in case when the corridor development program gets to the point of actually being able to signal that there is funding to move forward with actually providing that service, that if the station location that we recommend in this study isn't actually viable for some reason, we'll kind of have backup option. So that's sort of our process. And then in addition to us completing this station study, we also are continuing to support the overall effort to expand passenger rail in Wisconsin. We see ourselves as a partner among many communities looking at how can we increase and improve transportation options for people around the state, both people coming to Madison, people in Madison going to other communities, but then also just kind of a net gain for everyone. I think more transportation options are certainly what we're looking for, and sustainable options that also provide economic development benefit. So this study is really about understanding how we want to balance different priorities for our city. So we of course need to meet train access and operational needs. We need to be able to accommodate the station program elements on the site. But we also have to think about, is the site feasible to own, acquire, or control for a station purpose? How can we minimize environmental impacts? How can a station location have the potential to maximize that ridership? And what does that look like? And how does that happen? Ensuring equitable access to the station by both different population groups, including low-income communities, people of color, folks that might be currently underserved by the transportation system, as well as geographic equity. So looking at people from both within Madison and around the Madison area potentially using the station, and how can we make sure it's equitable as far as the location as well as access via different modes of transportation. So lots of things kind of baked into that. Is there an opportunity to capitalize on economic development potential for the site? Trevor talked a lot about that. That's another piece, for our study as well. And at the end of the day, is there an opportunity to cultivate this station as part of another great place in Madison? So what does that look like is, something that we're trying to dive into right now. So I'll talk a little bit more about that here moving forward. But we are working very closely with Amtrak on this effort. Amtrak would be the service provider on the route, or that's the assumption right now. So the station program elements that we're looking at are based on Amtrak guidance. And what we're looking at is either having a station building or a portion of a building that could have multiple uses. So some kind of a space for people to wait, use the bathroom, get information about the route, possibly purchase tickets, things like that. We also need to have a platform that is connected to a track for the train to serve. Generally, the desired length for a platform is 700 feet, but that's not a hard requirement. The train could pull into Madison and only certain train cars could be served at the station. And there are a few site locations that we're looking at that wouldn't quite fit that 700 foot length. So that's something we're looking at. And you can get a little more detail if you're interested in that on each station site in that link that I'll put in the chat later. But we're also looking at transportation access and circulation. So how are people getting to the station? And then how are people getting where they need to go within the site when they get here, both by multiple modes of transportation and for people with different mobility needs and, just general circulation and access needs. And then an additional thing that we need to consider is if the potential has been discussed for Madison to be kind of an initial phase of that route that I showed at the beginning. So Madison could potentially be more of a layover or really a terminal station. So looking at do we have a place to actually store the train between trips? Is there a need for servicing the train, crew accommodations, and things like that? So if the site that we end up recommending cannot accommodate that on site, we may have to look at another location for the train to go, if that is something that's needed based on the service development program that WSDOT will continue working on. So all things we're considering through this study. And so kind of our process, so sort of the bigger picture is how did we move through this process, and what is the study doing to actually get to a station location recommendation? So we began with these station area corridors that you see on the map. And so we began with 6 general corridors, looking at areas along existing rail line that the team thinks makes sense to potentially consider for different reasons. And so we began with that a little bit over a year ago. And we had worked through evaluation of those different corridors. What we looked at were things like, how does the train actually operate through those areas? What is the general access and multimodal connectivity to those general areas? What's the land use and development right now? And what is the future planned land use and development for those areas? And how does that mesh with passenger rail? What is the potential ridership for those areas based on things like proximity and access to those areas for people both that are in the Madison area and also people that would be coming here as visitors? And then also what does the equitable access look like for different population groups? And so based on that, those evaluation criteria, we are now moving forward with specific station sites within these 3 corridors that you see here. So if you're not familiar with Madison, the downtown Isthmus corridor in the light blue area, you can see this is the Capitol Square right here. This is East Washington. The red and green lines you see on the map are the city's BRT routes. The red line is under construction right now, and the green line is in planning. So that's an important access connection that we wanted to be sure to show. The second corridor that we're looking at right now is the First Street corridor in this light red color, and this is the location of the future Madison Public Market that also will be beginning construction soon. So that's sort of a focal point in the community right now that can be referenced, which is kind of located right on this curve. And then the area near the former Oscar Mayer plant. So again, if folks aren't familiar, there's a large swath of land that was dedicated to the Oscar Mayer plant, which is no longer functioning as an Oscar Mayer plant. So there's some vacancy there. There's some development that's happening already. But the overall vision for that area for Madison is to really have that be redeveloped as a multi-use area with a lot more dense land uses and mixed land uses. So the plan is not for that area to stay industrial, which it is right now. It's for it to actually become more housing and commercial focused. So that's sort of part of why it makes sense to look at a passenger rail station in that area. So those are the 3 corridors that we're moving forward with. And based on the evaluation criteria that I described, as well as a few other criteria that we're looking at specific to the station sites, we have identified 8 station sites that we're looking at. So as you can see here, we have them categorized by the different corridors, beginning with the Monona Terrace. And then we have a site at Blair Street, Livingston Street, Baldwin Street, and then in the First Street corridor, right on the future Madison Public Market site, as well as across the street on Johnson Street. And then we have 2 sites up in the Oscar Mayer corridor, one at Commercial Avenue, which is a vacant site right now, although there is development proposals being made for that area. And then a site at Aberg Avenue, which was the former site of Madison Metro's transfer point, so kind of a transit hub that is no longer used. So that's a site that could make sense for a passenger rail station as well. So as we're looking at balancing those different priorities and trying to understand kind of what is Madison's vision for a station, a few things that we're looking at is not only you know, the logistics and the technical pieces of the site, but also, you know, what is the visual access of the site? How are people getting here? Can people see it? Is there a possibility for a public-private partnership? Some of these sites are owned by private entities and some of them are publicly owned. So depending on the site ownership that's there right now, we're looking at things like, you know, could a passenger rail station be actually part of a larger mixed use development where the station is a space within that larger building, potentially accommodating parking as part of that development. So all just kind of big picture things that we're working through right now. And then the overall timeline for kind of the effort and this station in particular. Of course, the station development is dependent on that corridor service development that Jen explained. So the timelines are similar, but as WISDOT begins their process here later this year and into early 2025, our goal is to have a recommended site so they can move forward with their planning and have a site location in mind for Madison. And then as the corridor planning and development continues, and depending on, you know, the progress of that, the city would then basically begin the implementation process to start developing the site. So that wouldn't happen until, you know, there was certainty that the service was going to move forward. So it would be further down the timeline. But the point of the station location study is to kind of get our ducks in a row so the bigger picture route development can continue to move forward. So overall, the timeline right now that we're showing very much subject to change, but thinking that a station could potentially be open to service by 2031. But again, dependent on a lot of different factors. So we're just trying to be careful to make sure that the timeline may change, but just to give people a ballpark idea of what we're talking about. So the next steps for our study are going to be, again, to move forward with a recommendation and then continue to support the overall effort. Happy to answer questions, and yeah, thanks again for including us on this webinar.
Thank you so much. We had fantastic presentations that give us a variety of sort of like scopes as far as state level, regional, and city level. I'd like to, again, if you've got chats or if you've got questions, definitely put them in chat. I'm going to start off with a question for Jen. So Wisconsin got a lot of corridor ID grant awards. As you're looking at the actual planning process for each of them, how much is set in stone and how much will be studied? What I mean by that is, say, a connection from Milwaukee to Green Bay could happen along a few different corridors. Or is everything in between still in the development process that you can take a look at all the corridors and station locations?
That's a great question, Carl. Thank you. And I think there's a similar one in the chat regarding, you know, Green Bay to the Twin Cities and or maybe Whitewater Stoughton line into Madison. So where it really begins is our state rail plan and thinking through what those priorities that were identified there were. And there's also a state statute that directs the ability for the Wisconsin DOT to study particular corridors in our Chapter 85 of our state statute. So that's sort of Wisconsin DOT's starting point. And as we applied for these funds for the Step 1 application, that was what was identified in our application for FRA. So we specifically called out these corridors and their endpoints to be very specific with FRA so that they knew what freight rail line corridor, for example, we were thinking of. In Green Bay's, the trip up from Milwaukee up to Green Bay's case, we were not as specific because there are some alternatives there that we're going to need to look at more closely. But I think it just gives you a little bit more insight into some of those decisions. And each corridor, there's some other specific things related to it, but that's a general kind of concept about your question that to answer it.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question for Trevor. When you're talking about service development and exploring what that means in the planning process, are you talking about scheduling and particularly for KRM? I know there was previous efforts that were very much focused on supplying service during the peak sort of commute times. Is there a more open process for as you're evaluating what sort of service would be ideal for this corridor?
Carl, excellent question. We live in different times, and for that, we need to assess those previous studies and see if they meet the needs of today. And so looking at those service concepts, it will be about scheduling, it will be about frequency, it might even be about how heavy duty the actual cars are going to be depending on the needs of the area. And so it's going to look at stations, it's going to look at every element of the project. And so to your point, it may be intercity rail, it may be traditional commuter rail. The study will reveal what would make the most sense in the region and what would bring about the most development potential as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That really helps to understand the scope of what you're studying. We've got a question. This goes back to Jennifer. When looking at all these different corridors and putting passenger rail along them, is the state also taking a look at intercity bus services and how to pair those or how those might change over time to complement rail service?
Yep. Thanks, Carl. Yes, we are. There is a very, part of our rail plan shows the intercity bus routes alongside where the vision is for passenger rail for precisely the reason to connect and interconnect communities and understand how we might be able to do that with both passenger rail, intercity passenger rail, potential regional rail services, and also intercity bus. And so right now, a really good example of maybe a progression of, part of this, the steps in the Corridor ID program is what's happened with the Interline bus that travels from Milwaukee up to Green Bay. If there is a passenger that would like to take the Hiawatha from Green Bay to Chicago, they can purchase one ticket through Amtrak's website, and it will take them on an intercity bus to Milwaukee, where they will have a connection to the Hiawatha train down through to Chicago. And so that kind of concept where we've got schedules that have connections and we're able to, get the ridership through mechanisms that will help both passenger rail and intercity bus become successful. Those are the things that, we're really looking at as part, and it will be part of the studies as we move forward.
Thank you. I've got a question for Liz. When you're doing your study on the siting of a station and obviously working in coordination with WSDOT, there is a Corridor ID grant award for a connection from Milwaukee to Madison. Just curious, how do you also balance the potential future of a rail line coming from the south, more direct connection from Chicago? Obviously, that's not currently, there's no grant that is currently in place for a study like that, but just curious how you think about short term and long term?
Yeah, from a station location perspective, that has been discussed a little bit, a connection more directly south. And it's, it's a discussion of, is there a way to sort of future proof or not, or choose a location that it doesn't preclude that future extension from happening or allowing the station to serve that adequately. But I think at this point, given the routes that the state is studying and given the timeline for that effort, we're really focused on that as the primary goal, is to serve that route. So I think, if there's an opportunity to make that work, or to make, a future extension meet the needs at that same station, I think that, is sort of a bonus. But I think right now we're really focused on what kind of is in the plan right now, and just, trying to get that done, I think, is the first goal. And then, but I do think, of course, it never hurts to think about those other options moving forward and trying to make sure that, you're not preventing that from happening in the future.
And then my last question will actually be for each of you. And that's, obviously, there's been a lot of advocacy effort to get us to where we are, to have a bright future for passenger rail in the state of Wisconsin. I'm just curious, how do each of you see the role of advocates in the work now? And what do you think would be a good thing for them to focus their work on? Expanding new routes, or well, I'll let you take it away.
This is Jen. I can start. I think from the Wisconsin DOT perspective, I think hearing advocacy groups such as Thousand Friends talk about the issues that are important, and bring those ideas and issues forward is extremely relevant in terms of all of the considerations, at least at a statewide level, we need to take into account as we think about, potential transportation improvements. So I guess my advice would just to be continuing to have conversations and, to talk with folks and talk about the issues that are important, because the more voices that we hear, the more information we have to make a better decision.
Yeah, I would agree with Jen on that. I would also say, just like we ended the presentation on focusing on the why. Yeah, I think we as professionals and passionate advocates sometimes get bogged down in these important yet serious questions related to service, ridership numbers, types of more detailed track-oriented discussions. But really, when you can focus the conversation on access to jobs, access to care, access to sources of recreation, the economic engine that is public transportation, and particularly passenger rail, how that improves quality of life. And you can communicate with folks who aren't necessarily experts in these matters in ways where they will understand. How will this benefit my business? How will this benefit my current role with my employer? How will this benefit my family? And communicating about these visionary projects in that way will connect with people who may not have the same type of passion that exists on this particular call.
Yeah, and I think I would just follow up to say, I think in Madison, we have a little bit of a unique situation, which is that people are pretty overwhelmingly excited about this here in the city. We really don't have much opposition to this effort. More of the feedback we're hearing is like, where should the station go in the case of this passenger rail station? But I think, overall, advocates the important role is getting all those different voices to the table, and I think also helping us understand more about how to communicate with different groups. So I think sometimes, we depend a lot on the advocacy groups and the other community or other like local community organizations to help send, sort of our message or kind of help us communicate with those entities. And so I think there's a great opportunity for more partnership with, government officials to just kind of help us connect with people in a better way, because I think you might have a better pulse on what people are responding to. So understanding kind of what is clicking with people. And, I think that's part of maybe our role as well, as connecting with you more to figure out, how is the best way to do that and what's the best approach. I think, especially thinking about passenger rail, and a lot of these efforts span multiple communities. So how do you get folks from all of those communities to come to the table and communicate in a way that, like Trevor said, it kind of meets people where they are and with what they are looking for. So I think that's an opportunity for both both sides of the table to work together more.
Oh, wonderful. And Liz, I know that you put in the chat how to find out more about the Madison station location study. Jen, I know that there's the Wisconsin Department of Transportation rail plan. Just curious, how will people be able to stay up to date on each of these corridor ID grants and studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we are just starting that process now. There are, as we work with FRA, we're going to be outlining those schedules this summer and working through, what types of communication we'll be having with other entities. So while I don't have an answer right now, I think, we will be working hard to figure out how we're going to be doing that. Maybe we can a year from now have an update or something like that on how things are going. But I don't know the answer right now on that.
That's fine. We will keep in touch and try to help you disseminate that information. And finally, Trevor, did you have a specific spot that people can go to learn more about the KRM and the current effort?
Yes, so we just approved bringing on our consulting team on the 6th, so 2 days ago. And a part of their charge will be to create that type of public involvement plan. So you'll be hearing from us shortly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time coming out and sharing the efforts that you're working on. Thank you so much for your dedication on this. We will send out this recording, and we'll send out any links so that you can get more information. And hopefully we'll send out more links as they come available. And finally, please try again later with the CM credits once it's not malfunctioning. So any last statements anyone has, or should we be good to wrap up?
None here. Thanks, Carl.
I have something.
Okay.
Everybody should sign up for our e-news to find out the latest about what we are doing and webinars that are coming up and any updates on this information like rail in Wisconsin. So that'll go out with the follow-up also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.